What's up, freak bitches, wherever you may be, however you may be watching? Thank you for giving us just a little bit of your time. Back to doing a retro movie review. Haven't done one of these in a while, but there's something I want to get back into doing. And I'm so glad to getting back into doing it with my guest today, Mr. Alex from Alex and the Garbage Man. What's going on, my brother?
Doing all right, Frank. How are you? It's been, a year and a half of going back and forth on Facebook a few times? Yeah, it's been something in the making, and here we are.
One of many collaborations that I'm looking forward to doing this year. This year, one of my goals as a YouTuber is to collaborate with a couple of people that I've come in contact with in like the movie fan community on YouTube over the last couple of years. And I've already done some stuff with Knight. There's a couple other people I'm going to be working with over the course of the year, getting some things going. And I'm really, really glad that I finally get to sit down with you, a fellow cinephile who probably knows a little bit more about some of the movie stuff than I do. Just really great conversations I think we're going to have moving forward. And I'm glad to start today with this one. I mean, because how do you not like Clint Eastwood? The movie we're going to be talking about today is The Rookie. The Rookie is a 1990 American buddy cop action film directed by Clint Eastwood. The film stars Charlie Sheen, Clint Eastwood, Raul Julia, Sonia, Braga, Lara, Flynn, Boyle, and Tom Skerritt. Eastwood plays a veteran police officer teamed up with a young detective played by Sheen, whose intent is to take down a German crime lord in downtown Los Angeles following months of investigation into an exotic car ring theft. The Rookie premiered in the United States and Canada on December 7th of 1990, grossing about $21.5 million in ticket receipts, just under its budget of $30 million. The film was, however, overshadowed by the continuing success of a small movie you may have heard of called Home Alone, which opened 3 weeks early and ended up being one of the 100 highest-grossing films of all time. While a financial disappointment, The Rookie was met with generally lackluster reviews. Critics considered it formulaic and shallow and expressed bewilderment in the casting of the Puerto Rican Raul Julia and the Brazilian Braga as Germans. And a scene in which Eastwood is raped by Braga also generated some controversy. There was, however, some praise for the stunts and the special effects. Now, actually, I remember seeing this movie many, many years ago, and I just watched it again today for the first time in probably a decade. And while the tropes that existed in that era of filmmaking they were all over the place in this film, they're still very entertaining for somebody like me who kind of grew up in that era. But, I mean, don't shy away from the fact that even though it's kind of a cookie-cutter story for the 80s, it's still super entertaining. I mean, don't you think?
Absolutely, yeah. Looking at what Eastwood has done in the past, in the 70s and the 80s, this is not exactly out of his wheelhouse, but I always found it to be fun nonetheless, and it was always in the back of my mind whenever I thought about Eastwood.
Yeah, and on top of that, it pairs him with Charlie Sheen, who was just really hitting his zenith. It's like, all through the 80s he was getting big, but once you hit like 1990 when this movie was filmed and when it came out, it's really prime Charlie Sheen before some of his personal stuff started to wear on him a little bit. He's kind of classic Charlie Sheen in this movie. I mean, I always loved Charlie Sheen in like Major League and stuff like that in his kind of younger days before some of the stuff really got a hold of him. He does have this weird kind of exuberance to him that it's what made him attractive to so many people to see on screen for so long. I mean, what do you think of the overall cast of this movie, including Sheen?
I liked it. Of course, Eastwood not going too far out of his way, playing a grizzled cop, partner killed. Charlie Sheen, the young, by-the-book rookie, of course. Raul Julia, I've always liked him in absolutely everything I've seen him in. Not a bad word to say about him. Sonia Braga, that was the first time I had seen her on film, and man, what an impression she made on me. And some of the other cast, Pepe Serna as Lieutenant Raymond Garcia.
Yeah.
He was all right. He had the best line in the film, and we'll get into that in a bit. Lara Flynn Boyle as Sheen's character's wife. She was all right. I mean, she is supporting cast, and as supporting cast, she does support the main character. For as little time as he had on screen, Tom Skerritt was very good. I want to mention Xander Berkeley, who had a smaller role, but I've seen him in quite a few things over the years.
Me too.
I always love seeing Xander Berkeley. Yeah, one of the unsung heroes, like one of those character actors, one of those guys you see and you say, I've seen him in something else. Well, that's who he is, Xander Berkeley.
Well, he's one of those people you look at him, you're like, I could name 10 different things I've seen Xander Berkeley in, like, off the top of my head. It's like, you've seen him everywhere. He's never really carried anything, but you see him everywhere. Hey, a lot of great actors have made their career in Hollywood as, you know, the supporting actors, the character actors, the people that just show up in movies. And it's not bad. I mean, he's made, I mean, look, he's been in stuff. He was in 24, the TV show with Kiefer Sutherland. I mean, it's not like he's been in small stuff. I mean, he's just never been the lead. He's never been in anything small. But, yeah, you never go wrong with adding talent. And when it comes to talent, Raul Julia is not... I mean, he cannot be overstated just how talented he was. While this movie probably wasn't considered his best work, I mean, even he is still just damn fine in it. He is one of those odd people that can play the good guy and the villain with equal gusto, tenacity, and make that character stick to your ribs. I mean, because you see him as, like, you know, Gomez Adams, where, you know, you love him to death, and he fits the role so well, but he's one of the... He changes a couple of facial expressions, picks up a gun, and he's this evil guy in this movie who's just this random killer, and, you know, German car thief, whatever. I mean, he's just so damn good.
Absolutely. You see him in a movie, I think it was, what was that Harrison Ford movie where he played the lawyer? And he played it pretty straight, and he was very good in that as well. That was around that same time, 88, 89. And then I always remember Raul Julia from 1994 Street Fighter as M. Bison. And if you're going to compare, I think Raul Julia did a little bit better job as M. Bison as opposed to Neil McDonough in the 2009 Street Fighter: The Legend of Chun-Li. Although I'm not taking anything away from that film. If you want to see an interesting performance, watch Chris Klein in that film. Oh man, it's entertaining as hell.
Yeah, and I'm a big fan of Neil McDonough too. He's also pretty cool. But, yeah, I mean, the only thing is I'm sitting here watching this movie today. I enjoyed it because, like I said, I grew up in this era of filmmaking. But all the cheesy cop talk, it's so corny. Now, and a lot of people, and I get it, the younger audience watches a movie like this today, and it doesn't hit them the same way. But, I mean, for guys like us, I mean, that's what movies were for a solid 10 or 12 years. Was, you know, just the way these cops talk to each other, the way they made jokes in situations, the jokes that they play on each other, the donut jokes that kind of like carries throughout the entire film. It's like eating the sprinkles in the donuts is such a new cop thing, like Charlie Sheen does, whereas Clint Eastwood's like, I just eat the plain old donuts. It's like it was such a funny, like, cop stereotypical trope.
Yeah, they have that banter back and forth when they're in Eastwood's character's pickup, listening in on Raul Julia's character at his place, and Eastwood's character has this. He just goes off about the donuts, with these sprinkles, and no one likes that shit. And he throws the thing out the window. It's just hilarious with Charlie Sheen looking at him like, the fuck is with this guy? But that's how movies were back in the 70s, especially. They were gritty. Like, just watch movies in general from the 70s. People were yelling at each other in their faces. In the 80s, a little bit more sanitized. It was the humor was kind of, you know, corny. Like, I've seen quite a few movies from the 80s, being a product of that decade myself, and I'm glad those days are over, because looking back at a few of those movies, like Moving with Richard Pryor and The Great Outdoors, I'm glad that kind of humor is gone. Although, again, some of the lines in this movie, it is stereotypical cop talk, especially between Eastwood's character and his first partner. Not really hot on the line delivery, but he had the look, so I can understand why he was cast in the role, but it was kind of cookie cutter. So it was what it was, but it made way for Sheen's character to come in.
One of the criticisms of this movie is that he's just playing another gritty cop, that some people thought that maybe this should just have been like Dirty Harry 5.5, or I don't know what Dirty Harry they were on at the time, but Dirty Harry 5.5. that they could have just made this Dirty Harry movie. But I don't think this cop was dirty. I mean, yeah, he's just playing another grizzled cop, but he talks about over the course of the movie how his career has never really been much. His career as a racer, as a race car driver, had never really amounted to much. His career as a cop never really amounted to much. So he wanted this big score, whereas Harry Callahan was a very accomplished police officer, albeit a very brutal one, and one who went to extreme measures to get the job done. But Harry Callahan is, he's kind of the top tier of his profession in that movie, whereas this character that Eastwood plays isn't. So I didn't really understand that criticism of that comparison between the two characters. I thought they were very different.
Yes, if I remember correctly, looking at the trivia, Eastwood was doing an impression of the late director John Huston, if you remember him. So Huston apparently was very direct and gruff with people on the set. So Eastwood decided to take that and run with it because he had done another movie right before. So it was either right before or right after this where he applied the same idea. So maybe a little bit of tweaking on the Dirty Harry character and a little bit more of the corny lines to go with it, which I really appreciated because one of my friends from the You Missed It podcast, Zach, he loves puns. And Eastwood's character has some puns, and some of his facial expressions are just perfect. So it's not exactly a straight cop film. There are some comedic elements. They're quick at times, but they are there. And I appreciated Eastwood kind of dipping into that comedic side of it.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing, actually. He did lean a little bit more towards the comedy. It's not obviously not a spoof, but it is very much, him relying on some of that humor rather than just being that stone-faced cop who just is single-minded trying to get this thing done. He does kind of drift off into that humor every now and again. The jokes were a little bit more prevalent from him in this movie than they were in most of his serious films. Except for maybe Any Which Way But Loose, where it was probably a little more subtle, a little more straightforward. But yeah, I actually kind of appreciated that. He managed to make a cop movie without being so immersed in it, and I think maybe it kind of freed him up a little bit. And I also, one of the things I liked was I kind of liked the way the chemistry between him and Sheen was actually pretty good. I mean, it's the movie moves a little fast into that part, I thought, because usually I kind of like it when the two oddball characters that have to come together to do this thing, that they kind of struggle with their personal relationship while they're dealing with the bigger thing, and then they have that moment where it kind of all comes together. Of course, it's right before the climactic point. That's how movies go. This one, it kind of came together really, really quickly. It's like they have that one thing that happens in the bar earlier in the movie, and then they go back to Eastwood's place, and it's like, oh, suddenly, literally in the blink of an eye, they start bonding over motorcycles and cars, and it's like he starts telling his story, and it's like, oh, my wife left me. She liked racing. She didn't like me. Blah blah blah. And then it was like from then on out, they were just like buddy buddy, and I was like, okay, that happens a little fast. But again, that's kind of how things happen in the 80s. The other thing I noticed is this movie moves really, really fast. Because when we get to the point where they take Clint Eastwood hostage at the casino, that happens like halfway through the movie. Yep. And I was like, man, this is like a third act kind of thing normally. I was like, the entire second half of the movie is this weird journey of self-discovery that Sheen goes on while Clint Eastwood is, tied down in this chop shop. I thought that was kind of odd. Did you get that? Do you get that when you watch this movie like I did?
I chalked it up to it's all part of the rising action. And when we open the film, it's Charlie Sheen's character having the dream about confronting the fact that he was involved in his younger brother's death years and years ago. So this is at least partly Sheen's character slowly coming out of his shell. I mean, we all know about character arcs, and this is how we get from one spot to another in the overall arc of Sheen's character, being from straight-laced cop to someone who becomes the younger version of Eastwood's character, Nick Polovsky, more laid back, less straight-laced, playing it loose. So you can see the cycle, the continuation of the cycle from the beginning to the end of the film.
Yeah, I agree. Some of the trivia I dug up for this, a couple of interesting bits. One of them is that this movie was supposed to be directed by Craig R. Baxley in the beginning, starring Matthew Modine and Gene Hackman back in 1988. But the production was stopped by a Screen Actors Guild strike, so we could have gotten a very different movie.
I don't know that. Well, I guess with some of the tweaking of the lines, and Matthew Modine was a very good actor at that point in time, and, well, Gene Hackman, tough guy, can play a good cop or a bad guy. I think there was a movie in 1987 or 88 that he did with Kevin Costner. That was pretty good. But, for something like this kind of material, I think this works a little bit better with Eastwood, especially under his direction. It's a fun ride. Like you've said before with many other movies, it's one of those turn your brain off, stuff your face full of popcorn kind of movie. There's no Stanley Kubrickian changes that are happening in the background that you have to be on the lookout for. There's no 2-hour film analysis that has to be done. Sit back, enjoy the ride with Charlie Sheen before he had discovered tiger blood.
Suspension of belief is one of the most important things you can have as a movie fan. Because otherwise, you're going to sit there and you're going to watch something like Iron Man and be like, "There's no way this guy would be able to make this suit." You're not really going to enjoy the movie. No. But another thing that I had read is that during a break between scenes, in a very tragic turn of events, Charlie Sheen had the misfortune of witnessing the death of a window washer who fell 50 stories from a skyscraper above on a adjacent building that had nothing to do with the shoot, apparently. I actually tried to look up this story after I found this, and I couldn't find anything on it. So maybe it's just because it happened back in 1990. We were just kind of hitting the digital age, so maybe those particular news articles and stuff haven't been digitized yet. It's a possibility, but what a tragic thing to see when you're just out trying to make a movie on location. You see something absolutely terrible like that.
Yeah, and how that affects or informs a person's performance. I would like to know at what point in time during filming that happened, and could we see that affecting Charlie Sheen on the day? I would love to know that. It's tragic that it happened, and Charlie Sheen was battling a drug and alcohol addiction at the time, and if I remember correctly, Clint Eastwood took it upon himself to become a kind of mentor or father figure to Sheen at that time, which I think on screen really helps to inform on the relationship between the two, because you do see that in the beginning where it's Eastwood showing Sheen how to handle the job, showing him the ropes, dragging him along, him learning as time goes on. So I think that Sheen would get used to that, being not really talked down to by Eastwood, but being, kind of the student as opposed to the teacher that Eastwood was playing. That probably helped with their relationship along the time. Although most movies are not shot chronologically, so it's not easy to say that, hey, you can see that progression, but good actors make it happen that way.
No doubt. What you said about Eastwood becoming kind of a father figure actually plays in another piece of trivia that I had here. According to the book Clint Eastwood, A Cultural Production by Paul Smith, during the early stages of principal photography of the film, Charlie Sheen had substance abuse problems. Eastwood reportedly took on a father figure role in disciplining Sheen into responsible behavior. I mean, do you think any of that really stuck? I mean, because we all know about everything that Charlie Sheen has been through in the days since. It's all out there. You guys can read it. We won't go into any details. But, I mean, how much of that do you think actually stuck with Charlie Sheen? I mean, obviously, I think it worked out for the film anyway. And if that was Clint Eastwood's point, was like, I just need to keep you on the level and focusing on this film, and then after that, whatever. But, I mean, how much of that do you think actually may have actually stuck with Sheen and kept him from going, really off the deep end as his career went on?
If it did, it didn't last long, as we all know. I would think at least for a few years. It's kind of like when you're driving and you get into an accident. After the accident, you become self-conscious about driving, and you think to yourself, I'm not going to make those same mistakes. I'm going to keep my eyes on the road at all times, or whatever the case may be. But as with anything else, over time, you begin to let your guard down. And I think that was the case with Sheen. Maybe it had been long enough between 1990 and whenever he discovered Tiger Blood 2006, 2007, that he had just let it go by that point, because you move on from one project to another and memories become hazy. So I'd like to say that whatever Eastwood taught him had a lasting effect. Maybe it did, but the amount of drugs he did probably erased all memory and all advice, unfortunately.
Yeah, true. And not to mention, his actual father is an actor that can't be ignored either, in Martin Sheen, who himself has had a stunning career. I mean, Eastwood and Sheen are both Hall of Famers, in my opinion. So, yeah, I'd like to think that maybe Clint Eastwood, at least for a time, had looked at him and said, "Hey, man, your career is in its beginning. Mine is starting to hit the back nine. But I mean, let me give you some of the wisdom that other people may not have given me." And I had hoped that more of it would I think maybe part of it probably did. I'm one of those people, like, if I want to learn to do something, I go to somebody who's really, really good at it, and I'm like, "Hey, teach me how to do this." I can learn stuff on my own, but if I want to know the right way to do it, that's kind of the direction I go. And if you have access to somebody like Martin Sheen, Clint Eastwood, probably a slew of other people that are in their sphere of influence in Hollywood, I would want to pick their brains and find out how to be better at being an actor. So
absolutely, yep.
And maybe
But
that helped keep Charlie
sometimes,
Sheen's career going. I don't know.
perhaps, but that's kind of the curse of being a young actor, especially at that time. I mean, look at Drew Barrymore. She was in some pretty big movies, and she did stumble along the way, but she kind of turned out all right. I don't know what it is with child actors and starting that young, going off the rails at some point, and some of them never recovering, some of them recovering. It's a strange individual phenomenon. I mean, with regards to the people that Sheen was around, Oliver Stone in 1986, Eastwood in 1990, those in between and those after. I mean, he had quite the learning experience and the education, especially on set. But he did what he could, and we can go back and watch that over and over again. And we're still talking about him today, at least some of us, to some degree. So it is what it is.
And Sheen's overall body of work, I mean, for all the times that you feel like he could have blown his career up, has been good. I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, you could name 10 or 15 Charlie Sheen films off the top of your head and think to yourself, these are all really good movies. Not only were they commercially successful, but I mean, even critics liked them. So it's not like he wasn't very. It's not like he's not very, very good. I mean, it seems like despite the fact that he had tried to shoot himself in the foot so many times over the course of the last 20 or 30 years, he was still hitting home runs, which is even more mind-boggling when you think about his career and everything he's done to himself. It's wild. But
Yeah, absolutely.
one other thing that. Actually, two other things that come to my mind, and I mentioned it earlier on as I was reading the plot synopsis. This movie was very controversial for its depiction of a very provocative and unconventional woman-on-man rape sequence, with it getting a whole lot of publicity when the movie came out. Again, I just watched the movie, and while the scene is not any more risque than some of the stuff you see in movies these days, it was kind of an odd scene, because generally speaking, when most rapes are a man doing something bad to a woman, this one was very much a weird reversal. And while it did kind of work in the plot, because Sonia Braga's character is a very aggressive, very no nonsense, very mean woman, you figure, I mean, it makes sense for what she's doing. But again, it is this weird kind of role reversal. I mean, were you, like, in your memory of having seen this movie years ago and even watching it more recently, was there anything about that scene to you that was too much, like some people would think?
No, from what I can recall, having first seen it, when that scene happened, I wasn't thinking to myself, my God, what the hell's going on?" And even watching it again recently within the past few weeks, I thought it, like you said, an interesting kind of role reversal, because Eastwood is known for his tough guy roles. Well, what happens when you take a tough guy like Eastwood, you strap him to a chair, and you have your way with him? I mean, he didn't squirm and scream, mainly because he had a bullet in his mouth that he was biting on. no spoilers. But it was interesting to see Sonia Braga's character kind of playing around with it. It was like a cat and mouse thing where she was the cat and she was batting around, not exactly a dead mouse, but a mouse that couldn't really do anything or have anything anywhere to go. So I liked the reversal of the power dynamic in that scene. And again, no, I was not shocked at the time. No, I was not shocked recently, but it's something that you don't see every day. In movies, you're always looking as a filmmaker to show the audience something they'd never seen before. And the audience, again, you want to see something you haven't seen before. I've never seen Clint Eastwood getting raped before, so there's that.
Nor since.
Well, let's look at the box office for some of his movies and think about that.
Yeah, true. But it is interesting because you're so used to seeing, like you said, Clint Eastwood as the hero, the good guy. He's the one doing all the ass kicking. To see him so kind of vulnerable, like and not at all in control when he's the good guy, the bad guy is the one that's doing whatever, or the bad girl at this point. It is kind of you haven't seen Clint Eastwood in that situation very often, at least not in that manner anyway. But yeah, I mean, looking at it, I don't think it was any crazier than anything else, even really that we saw at the time. I mean, you got to remember at this point, I mean, Clockwork Orange had come out 20 years earlier, and Clockwork Orange had the theater scene, which maybe we'll do a retro review on that movie someday. but I mean, that's not even the craziest thing, because at that point we'd already had movies like Porky's and all these other 80s teen comedies that really pushed a lot of the sexuality and stuff like that. I just didn't think that even looking at it back with the eyes from somebody in the 80s and early 90s that scene was really all that much. But a rape scene is always going to. It's always going to induce a little bit of thought. It's always going to get some people talking, and the fact that the role reversal and everything probably made it that much more so. But yeah, I didn't think it was that big of a deal. But one more piece of trivia I did find interesting is that this movie featured over twice as many stuntmen as it did actors. And it actually set the world record for the biggest ratio of stuntmen to actors. Reportedly, over 80 stuntmen worked on this movie. Which I thought was pretty wild, because remember, this comes from a time where there wasn't a lot of CGI. I mean, CGI was still in its infancy in this point in 1990. So you had to do a lot of stuff practically. And that whole chase scene with them like throwing the luxury cars in the beginning, throwing the luxury cars off the car hauler at Clint Eastwood's car while he's in his chase, all that was done practically. So you've got 3 or 4 guys that are like walking around on this car hauler shooting at Clint Eastwood. You've got Clint Eastwood, you've got whoever's driving, you've got... I would imagine that was a closed set when they were doing this, and they had closed off a piece of highway, and all the people that were in the other cars were probably stuntmen. But it wasn't just that. It's like all the stuff in the airport, the final scene, and there were a couple other scenes that were pretty high action, high octane kind of stunt work. After you sit there and watch this and you hear this, you're like, I can believe that there was a whole lot that the number of stuntmen on this was wild. What did you think?
Absolutely, and this was, according to some critics, Clint Eastwood's most action-packed movie, and that's one of the reasons that I love this movie and have remembered it ever since. As time goes on and I get older, I'm looking at the rest of Clint Eastwood's body of work. I've seen most of what he's done from the 70s now, and stuff he's done recently, I'm looking at that. But I always come back to this because, again, I'm a product of the 80s. I grew up watching such 80s action movies as Invasion USA with Chuck Norris, if anyone remembers that. And I mean, yes, exactly. And I didn't watch them at the time, but even some of the kung fu movies from the 1980s with Jackie Chan, like Wheels on Meals, or pretty much anything Michelle Yeoh had done in the 80s, great stuff. Unfortunately, the action movie seems to be going the way of the dinosaur, and I'm talking about the pure action movie. Including this, I don't think there are too many movies out there like this anymore. When you look at the credits of a lot of movies nowadays, the number of producers and executive producers rivals that of the list of stuntmen you would see in a 1980s action movie, which is kind of sad. So I appreciated the stunts. There was one stunt in particular when Sheen's character is at the laundromat and Loco catches up with him, and they both go flying through the plate glass window. I love that shot, and I love the sound effect that they used for that glass. If they use a sound effect at all. I mean, sometimes they do, sometimes they just have the sound guy have the shotgun mic right above and they shoot it like that. With Eastwood, it's probably practical, so no need to insert a sound effect. It's stuff like that, and Charlie Sheen's second time in that bar. The interior of that bar is red, and I'm thinking, well, that's because for Sheen's character, that's hell. And when he's in there the second time and he lights the place on fire when he's fighting people, that was great too. Like and Sheen, he's not the greatest at fighting. Like, you look at some of his fight coordination in that scene and it's kind of slow, but he was able to do it. I mean, the stuff with the pool cue, he was able to sell that really well. Again, he was kind of slow. It's kind of like that movie Kate with Mary Elizabeth Winstead. Mm-hmm. She was kind of slow, but she was able to do it, so I give her props for that.
Yeah, this...
Going back...
No, go ahead.
Sorry. Going back to that rape scene for a moment, can you imagine Gene Hackman being in the chair getting raped? I'm pretty sure he would have said no at that point. And Scott Spiegel originally wrote this as a starring vehicle for Sir Sean Connery. Yeah. Can you imagine Sean Connery being in that chair? Look, I saw Zardoz. I've seen all I need to see of Sean Connery as in a weird movie. I do not want to see him getting raped in a chair by Sonia Braga, as much as I love her.
I really don't think Hackman would have done that scene anyway. I don't think he would have allowed it. And honestly, I don't know that Connery would have allowed it either. But I think it would have been interesting to see Connery in that scene, because it's kind of the same thing when I say about Eastwood. Like, you don't expect him to be vulnerable and at the whims of this female bad guy. But Connery, after years of James Bond, especially, and so many other characters where he is the guy who's always, the action star who's always in control, it would have been equally as weird to see him vulnerable and tied to this chair and at the whims of this crazy woman. That probably would have had the same effect. That would have been an interesting scene to see. I mean, again, especially after the years of James Bond and him just like snapping his finger and saying, "You lady, come with me." that would have been some very interesting role reversal.
I would have loved to have heard Siskel and Ebert comment on that scene if it was Sean Connery in the role, and their heads just exploding at that point.
That would have been interesting. Now that I think about it, that would have been an interesting scene to see. Definitely some craziness. But anyway, any final thoughts just on the movie as a whole? I mean, plot, characters, cast. I mean, they actually filmed this movie in and around Southern California. I kind of know some of the areas they filmed some of this, because believe it or not, Clint Eastwood was actually born in San Francisco, in the San Francisco area, and he filmed a lot of stuff around where I grew up in the Monterey Bay in Santa Cruz, California, in Santa Cruz County. So I actually got to see him do some filming when I was younger. So I mean, so that's one of the reasons I've always kind of gravitated to Clint Eastwood. He's kind of a local boy for all of us that grew up in that area. But just any kind of random thoughts in this movie as we begin to kind of wrap this thing up.
So Charlie Sheen was 24 at the time of filming. He didn't look 24. I mean, he was kind of thick for his age. I mean, you look at his face, and it's got some meat to it. But he did a fine job. And Eastwood was 59 at the time of production. This was shot during April through July of 1990. So he turned 60 during this movie. I mean, you could kind of see it in his face, but for the physicality of the role, I think he did a very good job. But I want to get into some of these lines that not only Polovsky, but let's say Ackerman, which is Sheen's character. So, for example, after the rape scene and Sonia Braga's character, for whatever reason, decided to tape it, I think it was something to remember you by, is what she said.
Yeah.
And before that great escape, I love that scene of the car smashing through the window and then the building exploding. That is an awesome shot. And I think David Valdez was the production manager, and it was either Eastwood or someone else on the crew said that they were given the time to do it right, which makes all the difference in the world. If you're going to do something right, you need to take the time to do it. One of the lines that Sheen's character had, it's after the shootout, and Raul Julia and Sonia Braga's character escape, and Pawlowski's getting out of the cuffs, and he turns off the TV screens, and Ackerman says, "Hey, wait a minute, I was starting to enjoy that." And Pawlowski looks at him and says, "Pervert." I fucking love that. That's what I'm talking about with the comedic side of Pawlowski. For example, the first time they were in the bar and Loco takes Sheen's character's ID and he gets beaten. He gets thrown on the floor and he gets beaten up. And Pawlowski fires a shot and everyone stops, of course, because a gun's going to get everyone's attention. And he's holding his badge and he says, "Now all you people driving without auto insurance are hereby under arrest." You can't go wrong. And after the car that they escape from the exploding building in, that comes to a stop, which is again a great sequence.
Yeah.
All the broken glass and stuff, all that sound starts fading away, and something that had been leaning against the car falls away, and you hear Eastwood say, "Engineered like no other car." It's not exactly action-packed and laugh a minute, but there is enough in each scene that I think this movie is, even though it's 2 hours, a 2-hour action movie, is worth sitting down and watching, especially if you're an Eastwood fan. And you've seen movies like The Gauntlet or The Enforcer or any of the Dirty Harry movies or Firefox. This is something a little bit different, and I really liked it. I think this was the last time that Clint Eastwood played a cop, like just a straight cop. He did play, I think it was an FBI guy in Bloodwork, and then another role at some point, but this was the last time he was a straight-up cop.
He's played like a Secret Service agent. But yeah, I think this was the last
1993. I think so, yeah. And people will say, well, this isn't a great Eastwood movie. Okay, you got a case. It's got like a 5.8 or 9 on the IMDb, but 2 years later, he does the greatest thing he's ever done, which was Unforgiven.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That might be his magnum opus. But look, it's not the greatest Clint Eastwood movie, but it's a classic Clint Eastwood movie. I mean, he's kind of given you the bread and butter of what most of his career has been. I mean, he gives it to you in this movie, and not to mention, and like I said, he does give you a little bit of the Dirty Harry, but with a little bit more comedy to make it different. And it is a little bit of Dirty Harry, but he's not the same cop. He's a very different person in this movie. So, like I said, that's why I didn't understand the comparisons of why everybody was like, this should just be a Dirty Harry movie. No, he's a totally different character in this movie. But I think it's fun. I mean, it's fun to watch. It's classic vintage Eastwood. Charlie Sheen does carry himself a little bit older. I think he always has, like you were talking about. Like he's very young in this movie, but he doesn't look it. I think because even now, and you could chalk this up to a lot of things, really. But I mean, he even looks a little bit older now than he really is. Again, probably because he's seen a little bit of life, but he has always carried himself kind of older. I mean, even in some of his younger things, like Ferris Bueller, that little cameo he has in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, it's like, why is this 16, 17, 18-year-old girl sitting next to this 25-year-old guy on the bench in the police station flirting with this guy? It's like, he's only supposed to be like 18, but I don't know, when was that movie made? Jesus Christ, 86? Something like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, he's always carried himself older, and look, and he fills the role out pretty well. I mean, I gotta admit, watching him walking in that suit in the beginning of the movie when he first meets Clint Eastwood, which is a hilarious scene, by the way, one that is played through again at the end of the movie with Charlie Sheen being on the other end of it this time. It's like he's standing there in that suit, and I was just kind of looking at him for a minute. I was like, the guy cleaned up really, really well when he tried. It's like he looked great. He just didn't always try, but. It's a fun movie. It's classic vintage Eastwood. It's good young Charlie Sheen. It's Tom Skerritt, who you never go wrong with Tom Skerritt. Lara Flynn Boyle, who was still very, very young at the time. Her career would go on to do some fantastic things. I mean, she would do Wayne's World a few years after this, which is one of the classic comedy movies. You have a Hall of Famer like Raul Julia, who, rest in peace, Raul Julia. Everything that guy did was just gold. I mean, he was great in terrible movies. The guy was just good. Go read some of his history. Classically trained, all kinds of different. What was it? One of his parents was not an opera singer. I forget. I was something I was reading earlier today. I just didn't commit it to memory. But yeah, so being that good was just in his blood, and just go see it. It's a fun movie. Again, suspension of belief. Just turn off that part of your brain and enjoy it. And if you do that, you're gonna like this movie. Again, it's a classic. When they start making box sets of the top 20 Clint Eastwood movies, I would put this in there somewhere. I mean, maybe not number 1, maybe number 18, but it'd be in there. It's fun, and it's also a good callback to just the way movies were made back in the late 80s and early 90s. It's like, yeah, I know they were a bit one-dimensional. They didn't always have the best dialogue. Sometimes it was over-delivered and cheesy. But it's like, those are comfort movies. I mean, those are the movies that you go back to because they're going to be good to watch. 20 years later, they're going to be good to watch. In this case, 30 years later? 30 years later, they're going to be good to watch. And they're just fun. Enjoy them. That's all I'm saying. But anyway.
Absolutely.
I want to thank my good friend Alex. Alex, where can the folks find you on the internet before you step away?
The folks can find me in 2 places. Number 1, on the Alex and the Garbage Man podcast, which happens on Facebook and YouTube every Thursday night at 6 p.m. Pacific, with my good friend and co-host, Dr. Nick the Ninja Garbage Man. How did he get all those titles? Good question. You have to watch in order to find out. And secondly, the You Missed It podcast, which is a podcast where we talk about movies that we think are underrated with my co-hosts, Jack, Zach, Rylan, and Andrew. We have a Facebook page, a YouTube page. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram at YMI_podcast. And all of our episodes are hosted on SoundCloud. Look for You Missed It podcast.
As for me, you can find me here every Thursday going over all the stuff that happens in news and entertainment with my co-hosts, Lady Cora, and my hetero life mate, Jeremy. You can also find me on Sundays on the Derailed podcast, talking about all the other craziness going on in the world around that doesn't usually have anything to do with entertainment. And we will see you guys later on. Adios.